The bangs are new. I'm still learning how to style them. Also, background noise from my heater is just gonna be a thing, just so you know. Today, I am finally giving my review for Prince Caspian from the Chronicles of Narnia. When I started my booktube channel, I really wanted to do a specific series of videos dedicated to a specific series of books, and I chose the Chronicles of Narnia because they're one of my all-time favorite children's fantasy series, and because I feel like the Chronicles of Narnia have been getting a lot of flack recently, and I wanted to kind of champion the cause of why I think these books are great. I haven't actually done a video in this series in a really long time, but in the month of January I read Prince Caspian and I took lots of notes and did lots of in-depth reading, and so I'm excited to share with you what I learned today. If you have not read Prince Caspian or the Chronicles of Narnia in general, this book follows the Pevensey siblings as they re-enter Narnia for the second time and they find that nothing is like they remember it. In fact, hundreds of years have gone by and the country is completely changed from when they used to rule there. There's currently a war happening in which the original inhabitants of Narnia are kind of underground and fighting against what is essentially invaders, but invaders who have been occupying their land for hundreds of years. Prince Caspian is the rightful king of Narnia. Although he does come from these invaders, he has been chosen by the Narnians to lead them back into the sunlight and defeat his own people. The Pevensies are called back into Narnia when Caspian uses a magic horn left behind by Susan when she went home the first time to call for aid. He's not sure what form this aid is going to come as, but we know it's going to be the Pevensies. My favorite part of this book is that it is full of nostalgia and kind of a base sadness at the way that life changes and the world changes as you get older, and how you can't really go home again. You know that old saying, you can't really go back to the same Narnia again. This story was definitely written for an older audience. In fact, the dedication for the story was to a girl named Mary Claire, who is the 15-year-old daughter of one of Lewis's friends. I think he was a doctor friend, something like that. You can also tell that the story was just written for an older audience as it has a lot less whimsy from the first book, and it is a lot more focused on the kind of the nitty-gritties of the battle and gathering of troops, and it's a bit more political than the first one is. I really love how this book delves into a lot greater world building, and that Lewis gives a lot of background on how he views the mechanics of traveling from Earth to Narnia. Specifically when it comes to the fact that the Pevensies lived in Narnia for years and grew into adults there and ruled, and then they go back to Earth and they become teenagers or kids again. Really, they're all kids. Lewis gets into how like the skills that they learned when they were adults and kings and queens of Narnia didn't actually transfer to their Earth lives, and they kind of forgot a lot of it. But then once they step foot back in Narnia, they start to relearn, or they're not relearning it, but it's coming back to them slowly, page by page, and it was really interesting to watch. And the way they kept encouraging each other, like, remember, here you're a king, or here you're a queen of this entire country. And that was honestly just so much fun to read and to actually see physically how Narnia changed the children and what it did to affect them as people. There's a lot of parallels drawn between the Telmarines, who are the kind of invading species of humans that have taken over Narnia, and the Narnians. And the Telmarines are kind of given an adultish, kind of modern outlook on life, whereas the Narnians stick to a more basic sense of the past and romanticize simple living and simple interactions and relationships. It's Lewis's commentary on his preferences for societal interaction. I want to go through now and talk about some of my favorite scenes from this book, because even though this is not my favorite book by far, and I really think that's due to the lack of whimsy and a lot of the magic from the other books, there are a lot of scenes that I just really truly love here. First, it is of course the first scenes when the Pevensies get into Narnia and they're discovering their castle, which has now been turned into a ruin. They're walking around having their typical sibling arguments, discussing, well, what world are we in? They have no idea, and eventually they come across crumbled stone and what looks like a courtyard, and they put two and two together and realize that this was their castle. It's such a bittersweet but beautiful image of coming home, but home is completely different. It's still beautiful, but it's not habitable, and they keep finding trinkets of when they used to live there, and pieces of clothing and armor that used to be theirs, and it's like the perfect epitome of true nostalgia. If you love like melancholic atmospheres to books, nostalgia, I can't think of another word for it, but almost depressing, then you'll love this book. Next, I love the scene where Trumpkin finally reaches them. He's come to gather them and take them to Caspian to help. Caspian and his advisors assumed that whatever help came from the horn would arrive at important locations in Narnia's past, and one of those being Cair Paravel. So Trumpkin pulls the straw to go to Cair Paravel and meet whatever arrives, and he meets the Pevensies. They actually save his life, and he doesn't believe that they are who they say they are because they were expecting kings and queens, warriors, grown-ups, adults that were going to help them defeat these other adults, and he finds children. Kind of as a way to prove that they are who they say they are, Edmund challenges Trumpkin to a duel, and not like to the death or anything, just a bit of a sword fight, play, acting to see, like, well, let me show you, like, if I'm not really who I say I am, then I shouldn't be able to defeat you in a sword fight because you're, you know, the great Trumpkin. It was just a lot of fun and a lot of interaction that we don't get a lot from the rest of these books. Edmund is a really skilled sword fighter, and he regained his skills the longer he's in Narnia, and I had a lot of fun watching him and Peter kind of tease Trumpkin for being a non-believer, honestly. Once Trumpkin believes that they are who they say they are, he sits down with the children and kind of gives them a background of what's happening in Narnia. What's going on? Who's Caspian? Why is there a war happening? And Lewis takes the opportunity to shift perspectives and take us to Caspian's perspective. And I love Caspian. But Caspian is sweet, lovable, slightly gullible, slightly naive, and very ready to kind of take charge and be a bit of a beefy guy if he can't be. But when we first enter his perspective, he is a young boy learning from his teachers, and his teachers are secretly telling him about this underground world of Narnia and what Narnia used to be like, and how a lot of the creatures and the animals and the trees are kind of living in hiding now because of what his people have done to Narnia. His teachers are all lovable, and his interactions with them just endear Caspian to my heart even more. And I really love the way that he is kind of enamored with this old history of his world. These scenes with Caspian when he's younger bring in a lot of Lewis's masterfulness with imagery. This book doesn't get a lot of that like the first one does, where he's painting a picture for us with words and with simple words, so it's not too complicated for children to understand. Caspian's chapters get a lot of that imagery when he's staring up in the night sky on the top of a castle with his professor, when he's traveling through the woods and meeting strange creatures and learning about underground Narnia. Caspian himself has always lived in a castle, and so when he runs away and is living in the forest with these woodland creatures, he has a real love for this kind of simple life, and the way that Lewis described that simple life to us was absolutely beautiful. Next, I have to talk about when Lucy goes and meets Aslan, even though the other kids can't see him. She's the only one that can see him, and that's one of my favorite scenes because it impacts me a lot as a kid who was often seen as a goody two-shoes when I was in school. I was not really interested in doing a lot of rebellious things or what other kids my age saw as rebellious, and I was teased a lot for that. Lucy really reminds me of that when she's trying to convince her siblings to follow her and follow Aslan, and they are more interested in following logic and Trumpkin, even though I'm not sure why they're listening to Trumpkin so much because they know more about Narnia than he does. But Aslan simply encourages Lucy to stick to her guns, and if they won't follow you, that's okay. You follow me on your own. I loved the encouragement that came from that, of just being who you are, even if the rest of your group, the rest of your friends aren't interested in that. If you know it's right, you need to follow through with it and not let them persuade you in their direction. I loved those couple of scenes that we get with him, and again, we get a little bit more of that beautiful imagery when she's dancing with the trees and Aslan in the woods in the middle of the moonlight. Aslan also gives Lucy a lot of advice on how things never happen the same way twice, and that we don't ever get the answers to what would have happened if we had made a different choice. I love that conversation that he has with her and the encouragement that it gives me for my own life. Next, I really loved the scenes when Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy finally meet up with Caspian and they kind of take control. Even though they are children as well, they have years and years of battle experience, ruling experience, being kings and queens of Narnia, and Peter himself is actually a very capable commander. I really enjoyed watching him take control of the troops and come up with a plan and enact his plan, and Edmund support him in that, and they negotiated with these adults of the Telmarines and they made stuff happen. Peter's duel with the Telmarine king was also entertaining. It was a lot more brutal than I remembered, but being able to get that glimpse of who they were when they were kings and queens of Narnia was cool, because we don't actually get to see that in the rest of the books. Like I said, this is not my favorite book of the series, so that's really all of like the favorite scenes that I have from it, but I do have to just give an honorable mention to one of my favorite side characters ever, Reepicheep. Reepicheep is a sassy, arrogant mouse who has a lot of pride in his abilities, but he also inspires an insane amount of loyalty from his fellow mice. He has a couple of great moments when he's interacting with Caspian or Aslan or Peter and kind of trying to prove his abilities as a warrior, and he's just so much fun. Moving on, I want to talk about the problematic stuff in this book, because like I've said in all my other videos, Lewis gets a lot of flack for being problematic, and I'm not going to shy away from that here, even though this is one of my favorite series of all time. I don't really give Lewis any leeway for being a product of his time, because I feel like that's never an excuse that anyone should use, because human decency is human decency. The number one thing that really bothered me in this book was Lewis's kind of discussion on almost a divine right to rule. So if you remember the prophecy from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it states that 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve are kind of destined to rule Narnia. And that's why there's 4 thrones at Cair Paravel, is because they were waiting for the Pevensies. Well, now in this book, we come to find out that it's actually just any sons of Adam, or he doesn't even say daughters of Eve, but logically you would think that would be what's happening, but really just a son of Adam is who is best fit to rule Narnia. And considering the fact that most Narnians are woodland creatures, mythical creatures, not humans, he's essentially saying that none of you native Narnian creatures are fit to rule yourselves. You need someone from a different world, a human, to rule you, because they're the most fit to rule. You know, what's not racist but kind of feels racist was kind of this. It was, you creatures, you lesser creatures, aren't fit to rule yourselves, so you need an outsider to come in and rule you because you can't handle it yourself. Super jacked up, super not a fan of that. Really, truly don't want to go there anymore, and I hope he doesn't anymore, but we'll see. Secondly, let's talk about the dwarves. So we know in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that the witch had a lot of dwarves serving her. Well, now with the kind of change of times, hundreds and hundreds of years later, there are different types of dwarves, and essentially you have the red dwarves and the black dwarves. And guess what? The black dwarves have a biological proclivity towards evil. I don't think I need to really go into why that's messed up, how the red dwarves are better than the black dwarves, and that the black dwarves just have a natural tendency, hundreds of, maybe even thousands of years later, still more inclined to follow the witch, the evil side, than they are to follow the good side. Specifically, I'll reference Nickabrick, who is a side character in this story. He starts out as kind of a morally gray character, which I was super surprised by. I didn't remember any of that in these stories. But Nickabrick is not super friendly, not super nice, and kind of a jerk, but he's still interested in helping the Narnians regain their territory, at first. Then it turns out that the way he is seeking to do this is by resurrecting the White Witch, and we're all like, hey, that's not a good idea, but because he's a black dwarf and he's evil and follows black magic, then he's a bad guy now. Super problematic, super not okay. Moving on. Thirdly, and I don't like talking about this one because it embarrasses me, because in the past when people would talk about how Lewis kind of gave Susan the shaft and treated her terribly, I didn't believe them. I was always the person that kind of argued for, no, he didn't treat her that bad. It was just she herself was bad and her character made her not fun, and it wasn't Lewis that did that to her, it was Susan's personality. And this book kind of proved me wrong. At every turn, Susan was thinking rationally and logically and practically, and she was vilified for that. She was called a wet blanket, she was called an adult, she was called a nag for trying to keep them on the practical route. And Peter and Edmund both decided to follow a more logical route as well, but you know what they weren't called? A wet blanket. You know what didn't happen to them? They weren't vilified as being a bore for trying to be practical, but Susan was. Susan was treated absolutely horrendously in this book, and he tried at every turn to make me incredibly dislike her. And I couldn't do it because I like Susan, and I think she's practical, and I appreciate her kind of thoughtfulness and the way that she seeks to interact with the world in an intelligent way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think because she is a woman, she is a female, she's a girl, she is seen as not as good as Lucy, who is more carefree and more willing to go with the flow and has more belief, and Peter and Edmund can do whatever they want because they're guys. Along this line, at the end of the book, when Aslan is going throughout Narnia and he's kind of confronting the Telmarines and kind of picking and choosing who can stay in Narnia and who needs to leave based off of who it wants to follow him, he comes across 2 school buildings. One is for girls, one is for boys. At the girls' school, a couple of them, I think it may be just one, runs out to follow Aslan, and that's great. If there's only one child there who has an imagination pure enough to follow Aslan, great. But you know what's not great is the fact that the rest of the girls that stayed behind Lewis, let me find you this quote because it was awful. Lewis called them dumpy, prim little girls with fat legs. Fatphobic, misogynistic. Why are they prim, and why does their primness make them not have an imagination? Why does that make them not worthy of being loved by Aslan? Alright, let's talk about something a little less negative, and let's talk about the ending and its implications for the rest of the series. So, if you do not know, Prince Caspian is the series where Peter and Susan are told that they will not be coming back to Narnia. And I cry every time, but I understand the implications, and I appreciate the kind of philosophy Lewis has about magic and childhood. And I appreciate it so much because it makes it special. And we all know that when you're a kid, the way you experience the world is different than when you're an adult. And as unfortunate as that is, and as sucky as that is for us, the adults now, I agree with it. There's just something about being a kid. And I think if Narnia were real, the only way to experience it would be as a kid. As an adult, it would not be the same and we wouldn't appreciate it as much. Still, the fact that Peter and Susan are told that they can't really come back, it's just heartbreaking. And the implications for the future series is that Edmund and Lucy will not be coming back at some point as well. And that's especially heartbreaking when you think about Lucy and the connection that she has had to Narnia throughout this whole time. But it has a lot of implications for how the world of Narnia itself works and the magic of the world. There's also interesting stuff happening with the Telmarines and the fact that Aslan kind of gives them some backstory of, you guys were originally from the same world as Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy, and I can send you back there if you'd like. And he draws a door for them and they can walk through the door and they can go back to a place that they fit better at. And for all the problematic parts of this book that has to do with that conversation, I appreciate the way that Lewis talks about different worlds suiting different types of people, different creatures better. And Narnia itself just doesn't really fit adults from our world very well. They constantly felt like they were out of place, and instead of using that opportunity to leave because they couldn't really leave, they instead turned into conquerors and they turned into something negative, which also has to do with the fact that Peter and Susan can't come back. The idea that if they were to come back as adults, that their experience would become negative and they would try to become conquerors, or they would try to taint and change the way that life in Narnia is lived. So much more in-depth and more thought out than I think most people give this story credit for. And it makes me wonder, what all world building did Lewis have in the back of his head with this world? There's probably so much more that he knew about his story that he didn't write down in a Silmarillion Bible like Tolkien did, and I am so curious as to what else he had in store for the story. Also, at this point in the story, we realize that all of this has taken place in only a handful of days. I think it may be 3 or 4, and that's crazy to me because the first story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, at least took a month or so, and then they stayed there for decades. So the fact that Peter and Susan got to come back, but it was only for a few days, was also really sad. I don't really think I have much else to say. Like I've said multiple times, Prince Caspian is not my favorite of the Narnia books, but I enjoyed this reread a lot better this time, and I think I appreciated it more as an adult because I could tell that it was written for an older audience. and I could dig a little deeper into those philosophical and greater world building implications. I will be reading Voyage of the Dawn Treader in March, and I will be doing an in-depth review for that as well, and I'm really excited because that was one of my favorites. So hopefully that story kind of goes a little bit better. Also, in case you were curious, I did not talk about the movie at all here because I am planning on doing book versus movie comparisons once I get through the whole series though. If you love the Chronicles of Narnia and Prince Caspian and want to hear me talk about the rest of the books and do some videos on kind of the greater world as a whole, please make sure you subscribe. I post videos every Wednesday and Saturday, although my Narnia videos are only going to happen about once a month. But I don't want you to miss any of them if you're interested in this. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you disagree with anything that I've said here, or you have your own thoughts about Prince Caspian that you want to leave down below, please do so, and I will see you in the next video.